Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so how, politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Lee Battle and I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church, where I am currently serving in an ecumenical setting in Cardiff. Each week I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political spectrum. And so today I am so pleased to introduce the Revd Phil Jump. Phil is a regional minister for the North West Baptist Association, serving not only in Baptist Church across North Wales and North West England, but is also committed with God's people across our Christian family to help us to be an effective voice in our world. Phil writes a regular feature for Faith in Business Quarterly, which seeks to relate key Christian principles to our working lives. He also chairs Industrial Christian Fellowship, a charity that has been supporting Christians in business and in public life. And Phil also co-authored and published Love Work, a collection of prayers and reflections to help Christians relate their faith to everyday life. And so, Phil, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this week's Politics in the Pulpit, where indeed we find ourselves in such a dramatically different space than when we did Politics in the Pulpit last week. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Lee. It's great to be with you. And as you say, it's an honour, it's a privilege, and it's a responsibility, really, to particularly think about how we, as the people of God, live out and communicate God's message in some very significant times at the moment. Absolutely.
And so I think kind of the wrangling of politics in the pulpit has actually been, I think, very present in a really kind of strong way this week. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and whether you see yourself as a pulpit politician?
Well, I don't think you can be anything but a pulpit politician. One of the great famous Baptists is a guy called John Clifford, who really is one of the people who inspired me in my early days of ministry. I don't know whether this is true in the United Reformed Church, but when you become a Baptist minister, you have to study this thing called Baptist history and principles, which is, I think most Baptist ministers, dare I say, see it a little bit like going to the dentist. It's something that's painful, but you have to do it. But we were told we had to study a character, and there's this great character called John Clifford, who was a real activist in actually setting up free education way back in the Victorian era, and really wresting education out of the hands of, dare I say, the Church of England at the time. And he was often encouraged to become a politician. People would always say, you know, you'd be a great politician. And he said, politics are far too important for me to enter Parliament. I need to stay in the pulpit. So I think, you know, that's where I'm coming from on this. You know, we're a people of the cross, and the cross was a political execution. God speaks into the life of the nation of Israel. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Last time I checked, there are no exceptions in the footnotes. So if politics isn't in the pulpit, I don't think we're really thinking it through. I think, sadly, people narrow the definition of politics sometimes to it only belongs to certain spheres of life. And I want to say, no, what happens in society, what happens in our world, what happens to every one of us is God's concern. And therefore, God's people need to be speaking about it. So I don't spend a lot of time in the pulpit these days, to be honest. I prefer to walk around and engage with my congregation rather than stand 10 feet above contradiction. But I certainly talk plenty of politics, even if I don't spend much time in pulpits.
Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously, we've spoken briefly about our context as we've arrived this week to do the podcast. But from your own particular context, what are the key justice issues that are facing your congregation and your area now?
Well, I think the justice issues that we're facing are like everybody else's. I mean, I've got to be, you probably gather from my accent, I come from Liverpool. And I do think sometimes Liverpool is kind of used as the hotbed of poverty and want in order to make political points. And it kind of annoys me a little bit because we're like every other community. We're incredibly diverse. You know, we do have some very, very difficult and challenging areas of social disadvantage. We also host the British Open on Merseyside in both Formby and on the Wirral. So, you know, we've also got our leafy suburbs and our big, that's the golf, by the way. Yeah. And, you know, so we're like anywhere else. But I mean, I think obviously, you know, issues around the cost of living and they're big justice issues because it's not only a matter of how do we afford it, but, you know, dare I say, if you'd have found yourself a year ago suggesting that we should subsidise the use of fossil fuels, every environmentalist on the planet would be out in protest. And I think that indicates the complexity of justice issues, which is why, as a people of God, we need to tread carefully. And of course, all of that at the moment is overshadowed by the death of Her late Majesty. And I don't know, I mean, we need to talk politics today, but I guess we also need to take our lead from our politicians that they have suspended the arguments and the debates and the divisions and to recognise that there are sometimes more important and higher things. And it doesn't mean that those things aren't important. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be speaking out, but equally we need to recognise the times that we're in. And we do need to recognise the example of, I think, Her Majesty the Queen, who, for all the fray of life, pointed us to our faith and reminded us of our faith. Yeah. We may not share her take on our faith, but she reminded us of the importance of our faith. And if someone in the highest position of political, I know she's non-political, but she's also the head of state, if she believes her faith has got something to say to her, then boy, should we. That would be mine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, that just the sheer speed in which the events have taken place this last 7 days, starting with Liz Truss becoming our new Prime Minister and actually going to Balmoral to meet the Queen, not, 72 hours before the Queen died, she was still fulfilling her service and forming and inviting Liz Truss to form a new government and become our Prime Minister. And that would have been, a really political thing to take on. Then came the day after the talk about the electric, the caps on the electric charges and all of that, and the energy bills. But then the day after, suddenly this statement was released from Buckingham Palace, and everybody sort of was like, "Oh, this is different." The BBC interrupted their scheduling. Dare I say, when they came out in black suits, I think everybody was kind of holding their collective breath at this point. And so, like you say, everything has been, and not only that, we've now got a king in place at absolute breakneck speed. We've gone from what was to what is, without actually being able to draw any sense of, any sense of space in the middle of it, how to feel in that.
I think you're right, and I think you make two important points in that. I remember years ago I was asked to take part in this will make you smile. I was asked to take part in a consultation. I was living and working in Croydon at the time, and Croydon Council had employed these very, very expensive consultants, and we'd had this massive presentation explaining to us all the different lines, socioeconomics, economy. This is how Croydon is going to be in 2020. And the idea was that we were to have this consultation to think about how do we prepare. And it so happened, I'm there as a local minister, so I've got the whole Reverend thing on my badge. And although the people who were in my group were for different walks of life, it turned out every single one of them was a practicing Christian. And because I was a Rev, that's where the conversation coalesced. And what we actually came up with, which didn't go down well, was we said, we're sure you're wrong. we're convinced that these wonderful lines that you've just traced, that this is exactly where the course of society is going to go, one of those at least is going to not be right. And what we need to be is prepared and able and confident in the face of change. And I really wish I could sit with the people who told me we were talking nonsense when 2020 came and we're all sitting in lockdown and we've got a global pandemic and all their lines went out the window. But actually what that came out of was our Christian faith. We were saying that we believe in a God who is above and beyond these things. And actually the gift we have to give society is to say, in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of change, oh, thou who changest not, abide with me. And obviously, coming from Liverpool, I've sung that an awful lot of cup finals. But there's I had to get that in somewhere, obviously. But it's a hymn they sing at the cup final, which Liverpool play out a lot more often than a lot of other teams. But there's a truth in that. There is a truth in that, and I think it's a truth we can offer to society at the moment. And yes, we as across the church are going to have different views about the monarchy, about how important the business of Parliament should be in the light of, I was reading an article just this morning saying that businesses are counting the days. If this legislation doesn't get through, it won't be through in time in order to bring about the help they need. And of course, at the same time, we need to respect events. We need to respect Her Majesty. And I think that's one thing that we've got to offer. And it's interesting, you talked about people holding their breath or society pausing to hold its breath. And you can only hold your breath for so long. And then you need to say something. And I don't know about, I want to be respectful. I need to process this like everybody else. But, there does come a point when if I see one more picture of the Queen and Paddington, I'm almost going to scream because we just keep saying the same thing. And I think as God's people, some of those gaps, some of those moments when society holds its breath are when we can speak and we have something to say. And we know we're going to move on to look at the lectionary passages for today. And I think in many respects, that's one of the things they show us. Before we look at the detail of them, they are essentially offering society and offering community a liturgy in the midst of tragedy and crisis. And so, we can look at the detail of that, but there is a broader principle, if you like, that we can just stand back from and look at and say, what is our calling right now to help people process, which also I think then maybe gives us the right to speak into the public square when the public square reopens, so to speak.
Yeah. And obviously moving on from that, which will dominate our thought of the passages this week, especially as we now know the Queen's funeral will be a week on next Monday. So we'll still be preaching during this time of mourning in this coming Sunday. And like you say, I think the passages have got a lot to offer us when we think about lament and things like that. So start us off, Phil. Where do you want us to start this week?
Well,
with
I think we've got to start in 1 Timothy 2, really, because in many respects, you would almost, if this wasn't in the lectionary for this Sunday, I think somebody would be putting it in. And you've got this biblical call that says, I urge you that all petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. And I mean, obviously, again, we may want to debate whether and who should be our rulers. And, some people think Liz Truss is marvellous. Some people will be absolutely in dismay. They are those who are our rulers. And I think one thing we can agree, they all, both King Charles, both Liz Truss, have incredibly challenging agendas ahead of them. They are human beings, and I think very often in the political narratives we almost dehumanize people because we only see them defined by policies and ideologies. And I think we have to hear our king, dare I say. I was struck by the final words of his accession speech when he says, in carrying out the heavy task that has been laid upon me, and to which I now dedicate what remains to me of my life, I pray for the guidance and help of Almighty God. Now, we have a ruler who is reflecting to us the truth of those words from 1 Timothy.
Yeah.
And I think, we are the body of Christ. We are God's representative on earth as his church. And if we can't respond to that and simply say, yes, we will pray for you, we will hold you in our prayers, we will give thanks to God for a life of an example and service, and we will pray for our rulers, our politicians, our opposition, the different political parties. We will take their example and we will pray for them. And, sometimes I think the job of a preacher is to kind of bring God's word and kind of lay it at the door of society, if you like, as we've said, what you might call politics in the pulpit. Yeah. But I do think sometimes as a preacher, we almost, God's word has given us an instruction. Stop preaching about it and get on and do it. And I think the 1 Timothy passage, we've just got to say, let's make sure that we pray. And I think that's important to say into our free church tradition, because, and again, I think this gets picked up in the other passages from today, because we are very good at explaining things. We're very good at, that's kind of what we do really well. We free churches, we don't go quite for the same pomp and the same ceremony, but we're great at explaining everything. And maybe for this Sunday, those of us, people like me, who are inclined to be preachers, who really feel, we've done people short if we haven't given them a good half hour, maybe we do need to stand back from the explaining this Sunday and give people the space to grieve, to mourn, to prepare. Goodness knows how many people are going to be watching the funeral or lying in the streets on Monday. It is a kind of day of spiritual preparation for what is a massive, massive moment. I mean, I'm old. I'm 60. I also happen to share my significant birthdays with the Queen. So I was born on the 2nd of June, 1962. So every big birthday I've had has been eclipsed by the Queen's birthdays. But, there is nobody probably over the age of 75 in this country or this world who can consciously remember any other monarch. And that is a spiritual, it's an emotional reality. So, I mean, maybe on that one, we just need to hear it. I think the last thing people need to do is listen to someone talking for 20 minutes about the need to pray. I think they need to get on and do it.
Yeah, so. And I think that sometimes, well, most definitely, I don't think as a nation we've finished grieving for the pandemic, if indeed we've properly started grieving for the pandemic. Because we have, or how it feels is we've been bounced from one thing to another without really being able to sit with it and take our time with it and kind of absorb it into us. And I think the pandemic, the grief that's caused, I think when things like huge deaths like the Queen bring out other grief in other places from other people. And I think that we have to be very aware as ministers, as preachers, that actually that kind of these things can open up trauma, and that we are allowing adequate space for people to process that, or if we haven't got adequate space right then, is to tell people there is space around this to come and do this. And I also think as preachers, as ministers, that we also have a responsibility to have processed our feelings before we get up there, because I think sometimes grief, lament, it fires out in ways that we don't really or can't expect it to. And you said right at the top that you feel it is a responsibility, and I agree with you. And I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we're sat as near as peace as we can with some things before we get up there.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so much in what you said. I mean, just listening, you've reminded me that on what days? I mean, I'm trying to get my head around the days at the moment, but was it Wednesday? But the Queen died on Thursday, didn't she? And I was actually talking to someone on Thursday morning. I'm working with two communities at the moment to try and put together a sort of act of recognition of the pain and the struggle of the pandemic. And I was actually talking about how we were going to do that. And then the next thing, I'm getting loads of texts from my wife, Jan, saying, you need to put the news on, you need to watch what's happening. And I'm sitting here now thinking, when and where and how do I pick that up? And I think that's true. You know, those of us who like a nice, tidy world, we're just coming out of the pandemic and we're going to organize all these helpful events. And whoosh, there's a war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I mean, our churches, again, did a brilliant job of mobilizing and responding to people. And particularly, you know, for us as a Baptist denomination, we've got a lot of congregations in Eastern Europe and immediately are trying to support them in supporting Ukrainian refugees. And you're just thinking, oh, right, that's now beginning to stabilize and we've lost our monarch. And I mean, people talk about trauma and the difference between shock and trauma. And trauma is the gradual building up of these experiences, and clearly we have a role, or at the very least we need to have a sensitivity. But I think it's interesting what you say, because again, if we come back to the scripture passages for this coming Sunday, I think we see a lot of that echoed in them. Because you've kind of got, you've got this passage from Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is a bit of you don't expect to read Jeremiah and come away happy, really, do you? He is the person who carries the weight, if you like, of what's going on. But I think that's interesting because, again, we can stereotype people by their particular role in their ministry. And I think Jeremiah is trying to do that. He's trying to say, look, I am lamenting. I am writing these incredibly depressing rants because I'm trying to carry the pain of my people. And interestingly, in the particular passage that we're looking at from Jeremiah chapter 6, he's actually saying that, he's saying, Lord, I am here and my people are crushed. And since they're crushed, I'm crushed. I mourn, the horror grips me. And so you've got this prophet who is showing us, if you like, our prophetic role. Yeah. And so again, we can look at that. And I find Psalm 79 interesting because I think there's a very human narrative there. Yeah. I don't know if you've kind of noticed it, but what is the first thing we do when we hit a tragedy or a trauma or a major event in life? Our human instinct very often is to blame someone. When before our Christian identity kicks in and before we really start thinking, our first instinct is to, who can I blame? Yeah. Who's at fault here? Whose fault is this? Then we tend to go, because we're good religious people, it's God's fault. Why's God let this happen? Why's God done this to me? And then maybe, hopefully, we eventually stop and say, what can I do about this? How can I take that forward? And interesting, I think if you look at Psalm 39, that's the journey that the psalmist goes on. So you've got this pretty inappropriate stuff, the racist and goodness knows what, the heathen have invaded your space. Let's lash out at all these terrible people, and God, I want you to deal with them and get rid of them. And then, of course, you come to verse 5, how long, Lord, will you be angry forever? And so, this is God's fault. Yeah. And then suddenly in verse 8, we turn again and say, well, do not hold the sins of the past generations. May your mercy quickly come to meet us. And suddenly the psalm writer is sort of saying, actually, how have we contributed to this? What have we done in our past that has brought this about? And I think there's a very kind of healthy journey. And dare I say, we talk a lot today about the kind of social media age. And it's so easy now to make that initial reaction to something. And it's out there and it's being tweeted and retweeted. And if you're a celebrity, the bottom line is, if you're a famous footballer, there's far more chance of your opinion of something finding its way around the world before a careful researcher can tweet what they might think. And that's human. That's our human reaction. And I think that there's so much in this, really. Yeah, there is. Because you kind of, first of all, you've got, again, the church being told, this is our job. It wouldn't be in the book of Psalms. It wouldn't be in the heart of a worship book if it wasn't our role. And I think that the thing to me is that perhaps what we bring to the table here is to say, as Christians, of course we have political views. Of course we will react. But ours is not simply the task of joining in the clamour.
No.
Let's offer that to God. Let's do the theology and process it and say, well, what is God saying? And then let's maybe stop and say, okay, and what can I do? How have I contributed? And I think, you can over theologize this if you like, and so everything that happens is the fault of human sin, which at one level is true. But I think we've got to be careful we don't then build up a theology that says, well, if you're in trouble, it's your fault.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very healthy starting point to say, how have I contributed to this? Obviously in a role like mine, I often find myself working with a church that maybe people have fallen out, things have gone a bit wrong. And I find it's a very cathartic place when I just invite people to say, look, even if 99.9% of this is someone else's fault, how could you have handled this differently? What have you done that's added to it? And very often that can be the moment that we turn from the anger and the hurt and the pain to actually beginning to look at it constructively. And what I love about this psalm is it says, that's not management speak. That's not theory. That's not sociology. That's theology. This is exactly how the psalm writer deals with it in Psalm 79. Okay, the language is impacted by the cultures and the beliefs of the day, but the human dynamic, I think, is something we can take very much into our present circumstances.
Very much. I think we see time and again in the Psalms that movement, that movement of grief, and that movement of, for me, of just what it is to be human. When you're hurting, often the first thing we do is lash out. We don't often mean what we're lashing out at. We're just trying to get the pain that's trying to get in back out of us. But I think what we see in the Psalms is that movement, but then that sense of, I can't get it out of me, but God's with me. Help me process this, God. Help me with this. And then almost this asking of being delivered from it. And then this really now, how do we move on from it? And everything is so quick in our world that we don't have time, or we're not allowed time to process things properly. And we wonder why we struggle with things so much, because we're constantly putting things into our minds and into our heart, but we're not processing them, we're not moving them along. And this for me is really part of the beauty of our faith, is in our ability to say that to lament is godly. It's a holy thing to do, and it brings you closer to God. It brings you closer to yourself. And like you say, the Psalms, we see this pattern time and time and time again. If this is not what we're meant to be doing, why do we see this so much? But yet we almost fear it as well, don't we?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And again, I think, there's so much in what you've said there. I think one thing we've got to say is there is a difference between lament and whinging. And I know the two can very often on the surface look very similar. But I think, that's part of it is to recognize there is a constructive journey. We're not just going round in the same circle. And of course, social media, which is our big kind of thing today, is a great place to just hear echo back at yourself all the things you want to say. And lament is not that, it's a journey. But I how many times in that moment of lashing out, in that moment of hurt, of pain, do we end up saying something that we later more regret? Or even, dare I say, do we end up making the situation worse? And I think the other thing I hear from this is what is our role as Christian people to create the safe space? So, what the psalmist is doing here is saying, come and lash out at God. Come and lash out in the safe space, and then journey. And again, I think that's an important role that we all have, those of us who are called to pastoral ministry, but we can't always do that for everyone. And I think the challenge this week is, how do we create the communal space, the communal safe space for people to express their grief or their anger or their worry. You know,
Yeah.
that I'm sure there are people who are going to be watching the Queen's funeral on Mondays that, yeah, but I'm still worried about my electricity bill. I'm still worried about how I'm going to cope with such and such. I
Yeah.
remember,
Go on.
well, I was just going to say, I remember my dad died at the same day as Freddie Mercury. And you know, the Freddie Mercury, the famous singer from Queen, and everyone was making this big thing about this big star. And I'm sort of sitting there, but what about my grief? Where do I fit into it? And of course, there will be people who have faced all kinds of tragedies in the last few days, who will feel they don't even have permission to sort of stand up and say, well, you know, I've lost my mum, I've lost my husband, I've just been given some terrible diagnostic news, and there isn't anywhere for me to go at the moment, because everyone is, you know, and that isn't to say we don't hugely mourn our Queen, but there are other stories, and again, you know, how much of the task of the church is to bring the stories from the margins to the centre. And interestingly, you know, people have said that was what Prince Charles did when he was Prince Charles, our king, as Prince of Wales, was tried really hard. And again, you know, there are plenty of people will criticise him, but I know plenty of people in my native Merseyside who can say, yes, I was brought from the margins to the centre through the works of the Prince's Trust and such things. And we've got to keep doing that job too, I think.
Yeah. And I think we also, though, and I think I see this in the Luke passage, is that tension between holding two different spaces, because not all people feel okay about the monarchy. That, you know, there is a longer, difficult history attached to the established like monarchy, and so for some people, I don't hear any kind of sense of, yes, she's gone, but actually this is bringing up wounds, difficult wounds. And I think the tension is to create space for that as well. And to say that we know that as a nation, we have a difficult history. And some of that history was when Queen Elizabeth was the monarch. That's not to say that she was kind of the architect of it, but when things like this happen, so comes this grief from the margins, from the people that, you know, this is a difficult concept. It's a difficult concept to have a monarchy in a world that costs so much money when everybody else is so struggling. And part of me sees so much of this tension in the Luke reading today.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and it is a very difficult line. I mean, the Luke reading, which I think, you know, I was hoping we'd run out of time before we got to, because it is a very difficult. No, I wasn't really. I was okay, but you know, it's an incredibly difficult story. You know, you've got this man who essentially deceives his boss and is dishonest, and then Jesus is commending him, and you're sitting there going, "Oh my goodness me, what on earth are we supposed to take from this?" And I think it's interesting because it highlights the fact that so often, as preachers particularly, we always want to tidy up. We always want to leave everything neat and tidy. And it seems to me that Jesus is saying here it's a messy world. And it's fascinating because this is, I've read quite a lot of commentators on this because I knew we were going to end up talking about it. And I was intrigued by some of the intellectual somersaults that some of the commentators are trying to do.
Very much so.
Because they so want to tidy this up to well, he's either good or he's bad. And you know, I think actually the best person you can quote on this is that famous German philosopher, Jürgen Klopp, who is the manager of Liverpool. And he was being interviewed after a match when Liverpool had you know, won brilliantly well. But they were playing quite a lower league side. And so you know, the commentator said, well, yes, Mr. Klopp, you know, you may have won 5-0, but you were playing quite a lower league side. And he said, well, you can only play the team that's on the pitch. And actually, I sort of carried that a lot into life, that I think, you know, both if we look at our monarch, there are lots of things in the monarchy that we would say, yes, we do have to ask huge questions about the empire that she inherited, about the wealth, about how these estates are used. but I think you could say she was someone who, as a Christian, did her best to play the team in front of her, to deal with the circumstances that were there. And, I was reading something the other day, someone being very, very critical of the Duchy of Cornwall and all the wealth that's tied up in that. And yes, I don't think we can deny any of that. But environmentalists would say, yes, but here is also someone who used that to pioneer farming techniques, to get a message out there about the sustainability of the planet that we needed to hear. And that doesn't justify the wrong, but it says make the best.
Absolutely.
And kind of that's what you've got in this story. You've got this guy who's kind of making the best of it. And I'm trying to work out, well, is there a measure of sarcasm here on the part of Jesus? Is it a connection back into, because it's immediately following the story of the prodigal son. So you've got this son who squandered his father's wealth, and now you've got this merchant. You can pick up the justice issue about the fact that, basically there's been a rumor, and then the guy's kicked out on the basis of the rumor. There's no investigation. And boy, how many MPs' reputations have been trashed before anybody's actually done any investigation. So there's a whole load of stuff going on here. And I think if you're going to try and tidy this up in a 20-minute sermon this Sunday, well, please send me the script, because I couldn't do it. But I think if we can say, what this says is faith can be lived out in the midst of a messy world.
Yeah.
And that's what I pick up from it more than anything else.
Yeah, I see somebody who is backed into a corner, who is about to lose the job, about to therefore lose their livelihood because of somebody else, not because, and therefore, when you're backed into a corner, you will behave differently, because then it is a matter of survival. And I think that Jesus sort of is saying that we all, who backs us into corners, and what do we have to do to survive when we are backed into corners? And I think sometimes I've certainly looked at this passage from probably the overprivileged way of saying, look at you, what are you doing down there? Instead of actually going, what must he have felt like about to lose everything? What do you do when your back's against the wall? What do you do when you're oppressed and you've got no means to be able to get yourself out of this? And I think it is, again, it's that tension between going back to the monarchy, having this rich establishment whilst people are constantly backed into corners by things like energy companies and huge corporations. And I agree with you. It's just an utter mess of a passage this week.
But it's interesting, because I think maybe that's the other thing. Someone said, how do you eat an elephant one piece at a time? Is you can take a little bit of this. And maybe it's one of these stories we need to learn. So, I mean, I would agree with you, but then I come back and look at from the privileged point of view. And what's interesting is that the master, or the guy who has authority, actually listens to the actions, and he is then changed by the behaviors. And I think, again, that's one thing I think you would have to say of the Queen. And I think you may not say it of all political figures in the world, or even in our nation. But at least, there is this moment that says, oh, actually, what you did wasn't maybe as bad as the outsider might say. And that I think is something we can all take. I think, part of the complexity of life is there are some parts of society or life or my existence where I feel utterly powerless, and there are some parts where I have immense power and influence. And I think the question, very few of us can simply live on one side or other of a divide.
Exactly.
I'm a parent. I have enormous power over all sorts of things to do with my children. Well, I used to. They now have power over me because they've grown up. But it's a matter of saying, in every context, am I listening? Am I doing what is right? Am I doing what is justly? And I think that's, I've written a prayer for that a lot of people have used over this season. And I began it by saying, we thank God not, we thank God not for the office that she held, but the person she was.
Yeah.
And that was kind of trying to say, look, and we're hearing it, we're hearing Republicans, we're even hearing Sinn Féin saying, look, we do not have an issue with recognizing this individual as someone that deserves to be honored. But we ain't going to turn up at any of the constitutional gigs. And I think there's a respect in that.
Absolutely.
And others will be outraged by that. But we're all in places where we have power, and we're all in places where at times we're utterly powerless. And I think it's tread well. And again, I mean, there are some principles here, because there is something about being consistent. Jesus's applications, actually, I find quite difficult. If it had just left the story and then not put these applications in, particularly about, well, use your wealth to make friends so that they'll look at you. I mean, but I think what it as you carry on reading, it's a sense of, be consistent. Yeah. And it's something that's a real, that you mentioned the book that I wrote, Love Work. And that was what I was trying to get at in that, is that actually, if we're going to say that God cares, and then we don't live as people who care in every aspect of our lives, people aren't going to believe us. No. You can prove it from the Bible as many times as you like, but if you're not a caring person, or if you're not a diligent person, or if you're not a reliable person, then people won't believe God is a reliable, faithful God. So this is something that's very much on my heart, and I think we see that here. I think what we also see is maybe a shift that says, look, there aren't always rules in life, but there are values to live by. Yeah. And I think, that's something that's very important for us. We all live in different contexts. We live in a multicultural society. And as a northerner, I would want to say, let's just not define culture by the colour of people's skins. And the culture in different parts of these islands is quite unique and defined.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as a regional minister for North Wales, I have to embrace some very interesting issues of racial justice that would be very different, say, in London. But actually, there are consistent values that we can live. And then there is also something about God's authority. And again, you've got this final statement about God and mammon, which, of course, appears in most of the other Gospels in the context of, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And I think, I hear people say, this is the great mandate that says we shouldn't have politics in the pulpit. Keep God and keep economics separate. You don't have a conflict unless two things are related. You can happily serve both if they're not related. Yeah. So to me, if Jesus is saying you can't serve God and serve mammon, he's saying these two are totally intertwined, because otherwise you could serve both. So, I think that this is an opportunity to say, in the midst of this messy world, be consistent. Remember the values that we're called to live by, and remember that we're running under God's authority. So if you want 3 points for that on Sunday, that's my best shot. If that
perfect happens. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry I can't make them all begin with the same letter, but I'm not that clever.
Could you do that for next time?
I'll do that for next
time.
I'll
do it in a poem. So
I'll come up with 3 words that nobody understands, but they all begin with the same letter. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Phil, for coming on and sharing your wisdom and reflections. Thanks to everyone who has joined us to ask this question about whether and how we should preach politics in our pulpits this week. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast and share this with your friends. We love to have an ongoing conversation with our listeners about faith and politics. So do join in on Twitter at pulpit_politics, or using the hashtag #politicsinthepulpit, or on our Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues team. And so I guess not really a question this week, but more a thought about how we do create spaces for lament in our public churches and in our private spaces too. And so let us leave with a blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.